Good evening. We just literally got back from Washington, D.C., where yesterday there was a giant protest, which in my estimate saw maybe 500,000 people at least come out in support of President Trump. Unfortunately, at the end of the parade, over at the U.S. Capitol, 4 people died after some protesters breached the Capitol building and had skirmishes with the police. We were there live on site and have the footage of what happened, as well as interviews with the actual people who breached the premises. After all this went down, social media initiated a blanket ban. President Trump was locked out of his personal Twitter account. Facebook and Instagram kicked him off all of their platforms, although it's unclear right now for how long. And YouTube is now handing out strikes and also taking down entire channels which post new videos that contain false claims about the U.S. election. Let's go through what happened together. Now, let's go through what happened yesterday in Washington, D.C., step by step, chronologically. And bear with me because my voice is almost totally gone. First off, the day began very early. We left our hotel at around 6:30 a.m. and took a cab over into Washington, D.C. towards the Washington Monument. And there were a ton of road closures, and so this trip, which normally takes about 8 minutes, took around 30 minutes. And while we were in the cab, over the radio, we heard a pre-recorded message. It was kind of like a public service announcement from the mayor of D.C. And she was telling people to not go out, to stay at home, to not mingle with the protesters, and to not give them an audience. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I thought I would mention it. So we arrived near the Washington Monument on the ground at about 7 a.m. And that was before the sun even came up. And there were already a huge amount of people lining up. I would estimate maybe 10,000 people were already there waiting to grab the best spot in order to hear the president speak. Now, one thing I want to mention is that it was bone-chilling cold out there. So keep that in mind as you're watching all the clips from yesterday. Now, in terms of the crowd size, it was the largest that I've ever seen in America thus far. I haven't seen any official estimates come out about yesterday of how many people were actually there. But when I was in Hong Kong last year, I saw a crowd of 800,000 people. And the crowd in D.C. yesterday looked to be about that size. So I would say there were about somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people there in attendance, although that's just my estimation. So what happened is that the people that were gathered there at the Washington Monument for several hours, they were chatting, they were flying flags, they were singing hymns, and they were listening to the speeches. Generally, the mood was very friendly and jovial, and the energy there, it was pretty palpable. People were excited. Then, at around 12:20 p.m., President Trump came out and he delivered a speech. Now, I want to mention something. Our sister media, NTD TV, was there the entire day doing a full-day live stream of the event, including the entire speech from President Trump. However, that video got taken down by YouTube because of their new policy. In fact, their new policy says that we are no longer allowed to discuss election fraud. This election, the 2020 presidential election, was fair, it was honest, and anything that you've seen to the contrary is false. Any surveillance footage, any expert testimony, any witness affidavits, any personal experience that you have yourself had, well, you're mistaken. There's nothing fishy going on here. You are wrong, and beyond wrong, you are actually a thought criminal for thinking that there's anything wrong. Welcome to the club. President Trump said several things that I want to make note of during his speech, and I'll do it the best I can without having this video get taken down. First off, President Trump once again reiterated the fact that he was not going to concede this election. And second of all, he reiterated his hope that Mike Pence will not open the votes from several contested states. He said that, and Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not hearing good stories. However, that did not pan out. In fact, shortly after President Trump said this during his speech, Mike Pence issued a statement basically saying that he is not going to do it. In a letter that was sent over to the Congress at about 1 p.m., Mike Pence wrote that, "It is my considered judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not." Now, regardless, many people who were actually there on the ground did not know about this statement from Mike Pence because they were too busy protesting. So once President Trump finished his speech, people began to march from the Washington Monument area towards the U.S. Capitol. Now, the U.S. Capitol was, of course, where the joint session of Congress was being held, and all of the members of Congress, as well as Mike Pence, were there counting the electoral votes. And just for your reference, they were going through them alphabetically, starting with Alabama. So during this parade, we got a chance to actually interview some of the people, hear them out, hear what brought them over to D.C., what they were trying to achieve, and so on. Here's some of what they had to say.
At a
Beautiful Washington, D.C. morning where, I don't know, what would you say, 500,000 people? At least 500,000 people. If you want to just pan this way, look at this unbelievable sea of all types of flags, mostly American. Oh my God, from almost every state. We've been talking to people for the last few hours, people from every state, West Virginia, Texas. Where are you from?
I'm from Florida.
Wow, Florida. I went to school in Florida.
Amen. Not a woman. Amen.
Amen to that.
What brings you out here today?
President Trump, we need to stop the steal.
Wow, what do you think of the election thus far?
I think it's not okay, and I have many choice bad words.
What brings you out here today?
So I am here because I think that China is our biggest threat to America, and President Trump is the only one fighting it.
America needs Trump for 4 more years. I'm a Vietnamese American. We ran away from communists. We don't want America to turn into another communist. Trump have done everything and put America first. I will vote for the guy who give up his wealth for his country and his people, not for the guy who stole the wealth of the country for his own personal gain.
And so during those interviews, at about 2:40 p.m., we saw several police cruisers with their lights flashing rush towards the U.S. Capitol. And so we knew that something was obviously going on. Soon, we began to see people coming towards us from the direction of the Capitol, and some of them were shirtless, some of them looked like they had been roughed up, they had bruises or they were bleeding, and some of them were crying from tear gas. Also, it was around this time that many of us on our phones received an alert from the mayor saying that a new 6 p.m. curfew has been issued. So my initial thought was that there might be some kind of skirmish going on between protesters and Antifa, but that wasn't the case. In fact, luckily, I ran into someone who gave me this footage. What actually happened was that several protesters breached the U.S. Capitol building and made their way in. This forced a lockdown of the building as well as an evacuation of those who were inside. Now, by the time I made it up there to the Capitol building, the protesters were all over the balcony as well as the rafters. They had hung up American flags as well as Trump flags all over the facade, the front of the building. The mood there among the protesters was actually pretty jubilant. There was something like a sense of victory in the air. Now, not too long after we arrived, the smell of tear gas began to permeate the air again, and flashbangs as well as smoke grenades began to go off. Police began to rush the protesters, pushing them down the stairs and out of the building. Luckily, ever since my stint in Hong Kong, I actually make it a practice to carry a gas mask, a helmet, and a bulletproof vest with me whenever I go to events like this. After that, the police created a line on the first floor of the Capitol and started to push the protesters back, using shields as well as more tear gas, as well as what appeared to be rubber bullets or maybe paintballs, I couldn't tell. At this time, during these skirmishes, President Trump issued several tweets and short videos on social media, saying that you have to go home now, we have to have peace, we have to have law and order, we have to respect our great people in law and order, we don't want anybody hurt. However, these tweets and videos from the president were deleted by Twitter, and subsequently, President Trump was suspended from Twitter as well as banned from Facebook and Instagram. This standoff between the police and protesters continued for several hours, during which, incrementally, the police pushed the protesters further and further back towards the street, away from the Capitol building. Now, we actually have a ton of footage and interviews from this part of the day. We'll just need to spend some time collecting them because YouTube took down our live stream, and now we'll have to go through our SD cards and pull them out one by one. Sadly, there were both deaths as well as injuries in yesterday's conflict. 4 people have now been confirmed to have died yesterday on the Capitol grounds, including one female protester, who is a woman from California who is also an Air Force veteran, who was shot in the head within the Capitol building itself. On the other side of the conflict, at least 14 Metropolitan Police officers were injured during the clash, 2 of whom are in the hospital right now. One with significant and serious injuries, and the other with significant facial injuries after he or she was struck with a projectile to the face. So as you can tell, it was an absolutely crazy day over at the Capitol. After everybody dispersed around 9 p.m., the joint session of Congress actually reconvened and began to count the electoral votes again. And then at around 3:45 a.m. that night, last night, Congress certified Joe Biden as the president-elect, as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. President Trump then came out earlier today, this morning, and promised that there would be an orderly transition of power on January the 20th, while at the same time vowing to continue to fight for a better America. In his statement, here's what he said. "Even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election, and the facts bear me out, Nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January the 20th. While this represents the end of the greatest first term in presidential history, it's only the beginning of our fight to make America great again. Also, I want to mention that yesterday, YouTube removed at least 3 of my videos on this channel on Facts Matter that we released over the past month. And you now no longer have access to the research that those videos contained.